Well, welcome back. This is the third in our webinar series on the changes from version 8 to version 9 for digital technologies in the Australian curriculum. At our first segment of these webinars, we did introduce ourselves, and we also gave a link to the Australian curriculum and a little guide of how you navigate that website. So if you're interested in finding out more about us, the presenters, and the Australian curriculum website, then please do feel free to refer to that original webinar. This particular segment is all about the content descriptors relating to algorithms, algorithm design, and also user experience, the user interface related concepts. So that's what we're covering in this particular segment. And in the first segment, we talked a bit more about this, but the broader changes in the Australian curriculum include things like the change from ICT capability to digital literacy and changing the elaborations, making elaborations better. But again, please refer to the first webinar for that.
Yeah, and look, I think you might be thinking algorithms and user experience. Why are the two sort of been presented together? And I think ultimately it comes down to some of the structural organisation in the Australian curriculum. Both algorithms and user experience are sort of grouped under the generating and design substrand in the Australian curriculum, even though they are very different concepts. And so because of that, we've decided to talk about them here today, because a lot of the way that the previous version of the curriculum was structured had these things living together. And it's just an opportunity to talk about how the changes are reflected in version 9. So we'll be talking about interactions, in particular human-computer interactions. Obviously, computational thinking is very critical when you're looking at algorithms. Design thinking is an important part of algorithms and user experience design, and enterprise skills and innovation in particular are related to how you think about solving a problem and automation associated with that. And obviously the big concept from digital technologies, other than human-computer interaction, which is captured in the learning area concept, is that concept of algorithms, and abstraction is key to all of these things that we talk about, as always. So there have been a few things that have happened. The algorithm content descriptions have been split and refined, which is, I think, a really good thing to make it clear how students follow and use algorithms versus how they design them. The aspects of generating designs have been separated from the content descriptions as well, so it's clear that they're not related specifically to algorithms, and expectations around how students should interact with user interface and user experience concepts from year 5 up have also been clarified. So what's new in algorithms? Not a lot. There's been some tightening up of language in primary, but the expectations remain essentially what they were. The big thing, though, that's been called out was that, as we expect students to validate their algorithms with increasing complexity, we actually have content descriptions that separate out that idea of tracing and testing algorithms, ensuring that they're correct, understanding what they do, from the aspect of designing an algorithm to solve a problem. The other thing that jumps out is the algorithms content descriptions now call out the level of complexity that we expect students to be able to demonstrate in their algorithms. So there's references to the types of control structures, but also how they're organized and how they're nested, which will provide a lot of clarity for assessment purposes, because you'll be able to understand when a student is, say, using an if statement, whether they're using it at the level that we would expect to see students in that particular year level operate at, or if they're still using it in a simpler way that doesn't really demonstrate that additional complexity that we want to see in the solutions that they're thinking about and building. The other thing that I mentioned was the separation of the design statements. They are no longer in the algorithms content description. That doesn't mean that you don't think about, the design process in the context of an algorithm, but it really demonstrates that it is something that should be done across all aspects of the design of a solution, not just when coming up with an algorithm design. And so, that really does call out that or make it clear that when we're doing user interface or user experience things, that process of prototyping, of thinking about multiple solutions, it applies there as well as it does to algorithms. When we talk about user experience, we make it clear for primary teachers that when students are designing a user interface in year 5 and 6, it doesn't need to be implemented in code. In fact, it doesn't even have to be digital. So we just want them to think about conceptually what the components of a UI are and what you should be thinking about when you design your interfaces to systems. It's actually not until you hit year 9 and 10 where there's an expectation that the user experience is fully prototyped digitally. So now that that's been made explicit, I think it will help teachers who are trying to come up with a sequence of learning across multiple year levels to get the scope of each of the year levels appropriate and correct, so that you're not trying to do too much in one place, or that you don't do too much repetitive stuff across the different year levels. And I think that's only going to lead to more coherent and cohesive learning programs right across the board. So we're going to dive into some content descriptions, have a little bit of a look at how this has all come to pass in version 9 compared to version 8. So first one on first cab off the rank is algorithms in years 5 and 6. And you can see here the design, modify and follow algorithms is all sort of combined in with, you know, what mechanical aspects of algorithms are involved. So you can see now we've got the design algorithms with branching and iteration as one content description. And we've separated out that idea that students are generating, modifying, and communicating and evaluating the various designs they come up with. And so that's a more general statement that applies to user experience, that you could see applying to an iterative requirements specification process. The idea really is that students are undertaking that idea of coming up with something new, modifying it, testing it, see how it works from a communication perspective, how effectively does it meet the need. That process is something that should be ongoing. And if we look at the elaborations for that, you can see that, you know, ideation is a key part of that, making sure that you compare them with what your design criteria actually is. You can see a reference to user stories there. We'll come back to that in the next webinar that we're doing, where we're looking at the design process more broadly. But the real emphasis and key to this content description is, and the reason the elaborations go beyond algorithms, is to make it clear that this is a process that I guess is tied very, very closely to that project management and you know, general design aspect, and is a key part of the design thinking process we want students to be thinking about each time they're coming up with the solutions to their ideas.
Just an interesting thing, I suppose, from the Victorian perspective, all of that creating digital solutions strand tends to imply that process, doesn't it, Paula? You've got that sort of whenever you look at that strand, you're kind of supposed to see that process of generating, modifying, communicating, and then evaluating. So it'd be interesting to see having this content descriptor that now just lays out that design thinking process explicitly, how that might fit and where that might be put.
Oh, look, I think it's a perfect sort of pipeline. It matches what we do in VCE. Language is similar, the ideation, the evaluation, and having it tied more closely, I think, with the specifications of Digi, the design thinking. I think this is a huge improvement in the version 9 for this aspect.
Mm.
Now, if we look at the algorithm side of things, you can see here the old algorithm content description for year 7 and 8 in version 8 was design algorithms represented diagrammatically and in English and trace to predict output to identify errors. Those have been separated, and because they've been separated, we can now, instead of using language like diagrammatically and in English, we can actually specifically call out things like flowcharts, pseudocode, mention the nested control structures that are an expectation at year 7 and 8. And then we can separate out the tracing to a separate content description. So there's no new content here, but it's articulated far more clearly, which will help teachers understand the expectation around, in particular, the complexity of algorithms students should be designing at this level. The elaborations that I've pulled out here are specifically around that nested control structures aspect of algorithms. You can see down here, we've got the idea of, in the first one, thinking about how you would modify an algorithm. So you can see there the one about calculating coins and notes and then changing it to handle new denominations. We want students to be able to modify, not necessarily always come up with their own. And I actually think that modification of existing algorithms and code is an absolutely critical part of ensuring students are capable programmers themselves. So, you know, it calls out that experience because it is absolutely critical if we want students to be able to be competent and capable in this area of the curriculum.
And that's consistent too with some of the coding pedagogies that are coming through now, where you work with someone else's code and then you work with your own code. So that's yeah, that's really good.
And it's also perfectly aligned with the critical and creative thinking capability in the Victorian curriculum in its sequence about modification. So I think there's a lot of synergy going on.
And then the last one there just really talks about an example of a nested control structure. User experience, if we go to Year 9 and 10, which is a sort of, you know, the upper end of the curriculum, you can see the old content description really was a bit of a word salad. You know, user experience and evaluate the designs against criteria, including all of these things. One of the advantages of separating out the generate, modify, communicate, evaluate statement is it actually allows us to be very clear about the expectations of the user experience, which is that design and prototype aspect. To fit that into what was already an extremely complicated content description would have made that even more difficult to parse. And I think one of the real advantages of actually having user experience separate is when we actually start to look at the broader design process, when we look at the creating solutions webinar next time round, we'll actually be able to see that instead of trying to incorporate requirement specifications here in this statement around design, we can do it explicitly by having a separate requirement statement that we then link to the evaluation process. And that stops us from needing to try to fit too much into these content descriptions to really focus on just those design aspects. Here is where we call out the prototyping. You can see, for example, that even when you're prototyping in Year 9 and 10, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're implementing the solution in a programming language or anything like that. You can use a no-code user interface prototyping tool. And there are a lot out there that do this, things like Adobe Experience Designer, applications online like Figma. What we want students to actually be exploring in detail here is user experience. And look, if you've got very capable programmers who are ready to do some UI related things in whatever programming environments you're using in your schools, they can absolutely prototype in that space. But I think one of the advantages of not requiring it is it allows students to really explore the concept of user experience in a way that removes the additional sort of cognitive load and overhead associated with solving what can be quite complicated programming problems when you're working in user interfaces.
It's also, as I understand it, Bruce, in industry, it's often a separate team of people that will be in charge of user experience, you know, separate to the people doing the coding of the application.
Yeah, and you know, if you're a user experience developer, then you can do both, but you're often actually, as you said, working alongside a whole heap of other user experience people that are not technical. And this, I think, is a really nice way of demonstrating that there's more to user experience than writing the code associated with it. It's that differentiation between user interface and user experience that really stands out in the new statements for Years 7 to 10.
Okay, so our last slide, as usual, well, second last slide, is the implications for Victoria. So some of the things that have been sort of brought out here is the Australian curriculum now is a bit more explicit in terms of how much complexity students are expected to be able to do at each year level band for the algorithms. This idea of prototyping that we just discussed with the user experience, and then what we also already discussed, that separating out of the general principles of design or design thinking process being explicit in its own content descriptor. What are your thoughts, Paula?
Oh, look, I think you've covered that that very well, and so has Bruce. I just think that more explicitness. I really like the prototyping as a new skill or practice. I I think the changes that are being made will certainly enhance teaching and learning.
I know that it's definitely been a thing when we do professional learning for teachers on coding. That is often one of the questions that comes up, even at a VC level, is, you know, how far am I supposed to go with the algorithms and with the code with the students? You know, how much complexity are these modules that I'm asking them to do, and how complex should they be? So to have that stated a bit more in the elaborations and in the content descriptions is really good.
So TLDR, if you're a primary teacher, algorithms hasn't really changed a lot. And you know, rereading the content descriptions just to make sure that you're clear on how close your program matches the expectations is probably going to be all you need to do in that space, maybe with a few tweaks here and there. With the design statements and the complexity expectations called out, I think, you know, we've all done a really good job this session so far, talking about the big advantages with those changes. And, you know, the fact that you can now look at an algorithm statement and not have to read into it what the broader design process relationship with everything else you're doing is outside of algorithms, I think that's a real strength of this change. If we talk about user experience and the summary there, I think providing clarity for primary teachers around what's expected around user interfaces is going to probably lead to a number of sighs of relief across the country, not just in Victoria, but everywhere. And we've talked extensively, I think, this session about the prototyping, about it being called out explicitly. And I think the fact that we focus on design rather than implementation in the early years will allow students to come into year 9 and 10 with a much better understanding of what we're actually talking about when we're looking at user experience, which will give teachers in the senior years more time to actually look at the challenges associated with the construction of a user experience through prototyping, rather than trying to capture, you know, a whole lot of the other broader understanding associated with that as a concept.
All right. So thank you, everyone. In our next session, we'll be looking at that, what Victorian teachers might consider under that strand of creating digital solutions. So the remaining content descriptors that are related to, you know, implementation of code and other things like that. So yeah, looking forward to that next time. Thank you.
Thank you.